Kunst kun je maken door iets na te schilderen, maar je kunt ook dingen maken die heel erg ver in het fantasieland liggen. In het Amerikaans noemen ze dat visionary art. We praten met Andrew Forrest, die in Amsterdam was voor een seminar over UFO's en over vreemde energieën. Andrew, you call this visionary art, and I remember that we did an interview once with Alex Gray. That's similar.
It's similar. It's multidimensional, inspired through the right brain very often out rather than the left brain. So it's intuitive, and it's from a place that's not conscious. It's like the collective unconscious. A lot of the paintings come from the collective unconscious, so I don't always know what I'm doing until after I've done it.
But the landscapes you make, the visuals, some of them are clearly inspired on, say, Australian Aboriginals, but some are, well, when I close my eyes and I dream very deeply, that's what I see.
That's true. Some of them are actually quite realistic, and in a sense they're taken directly from nature. Back to my easel, my studio, I walk a lot in nature, I take that back home in the unconscious and it comes through the conscious again. So it's what I see and it goes in and it comes back out again.
You could also say it makes sense, but I see archetypes. I see
there are archetypes for sure. Yeah, the archetypes come through again quite unconsciously. I don't control them. They come through anyway because I allow it to come through by not knowing. The less I know, the more pure they come through.
When I see archetypes, like I see a fish, dolphins in relation to the world. Now that's a strong image. Then we have the world as a entity, and the dolphins as maybe as keepers of the environment.
I think what dolphins represent are different things to different people. They represent play, love, joy, childishness, innocence, purity, but to me they also represent highly evolved, intelligent beings who are running the show. We're not quite aware of how much they're running it yet, but they actually know what's going on, and they're giving us information all the time through their play with us. So by doing it in a very loving way, we're getting a lot of information from them, and especially whales too.
We're here at a conference about UFOs and strange energies. Now, what is the relationship between your art and the energies outside, the extraterrestrial energy?
Well, to me, for a start, that's not quite the truth, because ETs are inside, not outside. It's all inner space rather than outer space. They're not coming from left of Mars or right of Venus. They're coming from an inner communion. And all of us are ETs. That's where we all come from. We all originate from star systems. None of us start off here on the Earth. So we're all in it together. There's no such thing as an alien, really.
Well, as a scientist would say, we're all starseed. Exactly. Somewhere in the past, we're all started as molecules, and
exactly, we're all from the same original spark, and we all end up in the same original source. And in fact, on some level, we're there all the time anyway, communing. It's only here on Earth that we experience the illusion of separation.
Now, you also make music. I mean, it's running softly in the background. Okay. When I hear that music and I see your stuff, I get into kind of relaxed.
Okay.
Yeah. In Holland we say you're a little bit stony. You get a little bit high on it, huh?
Well, if that's what it does for you, then that's a very good thing, because most people are very caught up in stress and running around in circles trying to make money to pay the rent. So if it's relaxing for people, that's helpful. But it's doing far more than that.
But if you paint, does it relax you?
I always paint to music. But not necessarily to relax me, more for the inspiration to flow, to allow a space from which something can emerge, rather than relaxing. I'm not that relaxed when I paint, I'm quite up, yeah.
But is it coming from a connection to deeper levels of your...
Definitely, yeah. The music possibly more than the painting, because it's instant, whereas the painting takes a while to evolve, to build up layers of paint, literally, if you like. Whereas the music, you sit down, you play a keyboard, it's immediate. Whatever wanted to come through is there straight away.
It's a real-time experience.
Yeah, or no-time experience. Yeah, yeah, it is actually. Seriously.
Well, that element of time comes back in your art, because the archetypal images that you paint come back in, say, like Greek temples or Mexican folk art, or in Australian Aboriginal art. It's all the same. It has no time.
It all connects up, because really, those particular indigenous populations you're talking about probably come from the same source. So isn't it interesting how there are dragon myths all over the world, and there are rainbow serpent gods? It's the same thing, really, expressed perhaps in a slightly different form, yes.
So there's only one perennial wisdom, one perennial culture?
That's my feeling.
And it might not even be ours?
Well, it is and it isn't. It is ours, because it's us, really. because in a sense we are everything. I don't know how cosmic you want this to be, but you know, I'll speak my truth. I mean, to me, there's no separation between anything. Everything you see, everything you experience, everything you dream, everything you imagine is. Full stop.
As the Hindu would say, there is fullness within, there's fullness without,
Yes.
there is only one fullness.
The empty fullness, the full emptiness. My aim in this particular incarnation is just to be, to stop painting, to stop playing music. These are distractions, ultimately, from being.
Thank you for your music, thank you for your image. We'll show some of the...
You're very welcome, thank you.
which I'm sure you're going to enjoy. We have my good friend and colleague Donna Nunn-Sims, who I shall introduce to you just in a moment. And to commence our presentation, we're going to again have the services of Titania, who is going to give us a bit of atmosphere in association with some music supplied by Victor in the sound box there. We are now going to cover Discovering the Mysteries of Ancient Egypt, subtitled Heavenly Maps in Monuments of Stone and Hieroglyphic Postcards from the Past. Donna, I can tell you, is an eminent Egyptologist, in my opinion, who also has the courage to step into the interpretation of myth and the interpretation of the science and the true meaning of the wonderful civilization that we observe now the remnants of on the Giza Plateau. This is an area which is developing dramatically, and in fact the Egyptian authorities, moved by a need perhaps to improve their tourism, have announced that from May, from the beginning of this month, they are engaged in a dramatic rediscovery of the Giza Plateau involving the opening of 10 tombs, the excavation of at least one new shaft in the pyramid, and the re-entry of 3 other pyramids. Key music. Now we have Titania. Thank you.
and that has a hymn to two sides.
The Dutch word or the English word is, but it's the lost information from the black. Is that is supposed to be under the Sphinx?
So
what is your idea about, or what you told about? What comes from your heart?
I do believe that there are a lot more records of the past hidden in Egypt. Recently, about 45 to 70 kilometers to the west area of Aswan, where they're digging to make another channel for the Nile, they found proof of a civilization that is 16,000 years old. Okay? This is just recently. And so, no, officially, I mean, yes, officially, they radiocarbon dated this. I heard this from one Egyptologist about 6 weeks ago, who is an Egyptian and who has good grounds for having said this, okay? Now, this is not published, but lots of things that are known in Egypt are not published, and unless you're in the field and you're in the grapevine, you may not find out about it. Nevertheless, we do know that extremely ancient humanoid forms have been found in the Nile Valley. Life in the Nile Valley goes back hundreds of thousands of years, okay? But the issue then is how old a people built certain things, and we don't have proof for that, okay? We don't really know.
You were talking about the heads, or you weren't going in there, but we're going to talk about that. But the tribes now in Africa that shape their heads into the sort of big egg shape, do you think that is just a tradition, or do you think they're copying something?
Could be either. I wouldn't want to say, because I don't know. I know the Native Americans do that as well. Some South American peoples do that as well.
Okay,
so it may be that it does change one's brain waves. I don't know of any research that's been done on children who have these funny shaped heads that have been formed intentionally and what their brain waves are. Maybe the brain waves are different in certain areas. Maybe they are remembering a past time. I don't know.
I was just thinking that effect, that probably the space in between will be filled with liquid. You know, and the brain is not disforming or anything, I guess. That it creates something like a dolphin has. You know, the sort of space that you can use for vibrations.
Well, the dolphin brain has to do with total volume as well. You see, that's not going to make the head volume not necessarily any much bigger. It's going to change the shape, but it might not actually change the volume of the brain itself. I don't know. Interesting things to keep track of and to speculate about. To keep an open mind about, so that we don't get dogmatic.
You never know.
Well, what they say in Egypt is there is so much more left buried in Egypt that there is an enormous amount left to find. And Egyptology as a field is only 200 years old. We have just begun to discover and rediscover Egypt. We have just begun. And because so many of the early Egyptologists were Victorian in religion and Victorian in manners and Victorian in lifestyle, putting Egypt back into Africa and understanding spirituality and religion from an African point of view, instead of, or an indigenous point of view, because ancient Hawaiians were also very spiritual people. Ancient South Americans were also spiritual people. And we have called Africans pagans because our minds are so narrow, because we don't know that life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Instead of accepting it as a different viewpoint, we say, no, it's not in our view.
Yes.
So it doesn't exist.
Yes.
That's why we can. Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
And our 20th century civilization does subsist on the whole psychology of not really considering the longer term implications of all of the things that we are doing at this particular time. And it's rather interesting how there is a kind of an ongoing state of amnesia, of forgetfulness, of not seeing with regards to the year 2000. We're less than 2 years away from it. And it's as if we're walking towards this point in history backwards. We're really tending to look backwards. However, this is very much a pattern of history throughout the centuries. For example, the same thing was happening 100 years ago at the end of the Victorian age, and that was that everyone was in a very, very self-satisfied state, as we are today, and thinking that they had reached the peak of human evolution, and everything had stabilized out, and everyone was was carrying on as normal, and then suddenly when the 20th century started, lots of things started happening. The era ended with Queen Victoria dying, which was symbolically very, very strong, but also, for example, the Wright brothers were up in the air in 1902. And the kind of civilization we live in is rather a permanent fixture, and it's going to go on forever. And in fact, when you, for those of us here who are more conscious kinds of people, I'm sure that all of you will have, at some stage or another, you will have gone through an experience of despair, perhaps, over the state of the world, and wondering, what on earth can I really do about it? What impact does my own life and do my own activities have in relation to the vastness of this problem? And what can I myself do to make a difference? And this itself, I would suggest to you, is actually a symptom of pre-change. If you look back at your own life and your own life crises, where life has hit you in the face and you've really been forced to look at some of the fundamental issues in your own personal life, if you think back at some of your own personal crises, you'll remember that, in fact, just before the changes started happening, you would have experienced this kind of state as well. It's a kind of a feeling of, oh gosh, here we are stuck in this particular kind of groove, and what can I do to change my life? It seems as if this state that I am in is just going to go on forever and there's nothing I can do to change it. Well, those are symptoms of immediate pre-change states. And change comes on very, very fast after one of those states. And I'd suggest to you that we in the Western world are very much in this kind of situation. Whether you're on this side of the fence, where you can see many of the faults and errors that we have in our world, but you're still kind of thinking, oh gosh, like, when's this ever going to change? Or whether you're on the other side of the fence, where you love to go to supermarkets and drive around in your car, and you really desperately want to keep the show on the road all the time. Whether that's, whichever is the case, still we are very much in a collective psychological sense in pre-change, a pre-change state. Now, before going any further, I want to destroy a few illusions. First of all, we are not actually reaching the millennium. We're not. It isn't the millennium coming up. That was 1,000 years ago, if ever there was a millennium. Right? Because the millennium, according to our standard way of thinking, is 1,000 years after the time of the birth of Christ. However, there are some extra problems here as well, and that was, Christ wasn't born on the year 1. Right? The best, I won't go into the details, but the best evidence that is now very, very commonly accepted by virtually all sensible scholars in the field is that Jesus was actually born around about the year 5 or 7, between 5 and 7 BC. There's a lot of debate about which precise year, but it's pretty safe that it's 5 to 7 BC. In which case, if you are a heavyweight millennial believer, then did you notice it? Because it's already happened, right? Around about 1993 or 1995 or something like that, if we are counting in thousands of years from the birth of Christ. However, there are extra problems here as well. And that is that if you read things like the book of Revelations carefully, you'll realize that actually all this business about the millennium has nothing at all to do with the birth of Christ, and it has nothing to do with counting 1,000 years after the birth of Christ either, actually. Because the mythology goes like this. And in fact, the book of Revelations isn't Christian mythology, it's Persian mythology. It comes from Central Asia, from perhaps, well, certainly 600 or 700 years before Christ, but probably earlier than that. But anyway, the sequence of events goes that first of all, things get really, really bad, and this is the time of the Antichrist, right? And then, after this comes the second coming of Christ. And so the second coming of Christ sorts out the Antichrist, and everything's groovy on that front. And then what happens with the second coming of Christ is that the world becomes transformed into a kind of a heaven on earth. And this is where the millennium starts. after the second coming of Christ. And it is in the mythology, basically, we are to have 1,000 years of peace and heaven on earth before the final judgment. Right? So that's actually the sequence of events which is painted in the book of Revelations, which, as I say, is actually a rendering of a much more ancient mythology. So, looked at in this sense, a lot of the excitement around the millennium is actually quite artificial, because it's based on a false rendering of the mythology which was given to us in its most common form, which is the book of Revelations in the Bible. In other words, we're not talking about 1,000 years from the birth of Christ, which anyway was 1,000 years ago. We're talking about another kind of phenomenon where the state of humanity and the state of the world gets to be so bad, that is the time of the Antichrist, that you could say the human soul cries out, and as a result of this crying out, the Christ returns and in some way redeems the state of things on planet Earth, and then the 1,000 years starts. However, even the idea of 1,000 years is a bit erroneous as well, because ancient people, they didn't have the same neurosis about counting that we do. You know, they didn't really they weren't quantitative people like we are. We are very statistical people, and we've got to have exact numbers on everything. But when ancient people were talking about 1,000 years, they weren't specifically talking about precisely 1,000 years. They were actually talking about an uncountable number of years, because most people in ancient times just would not bother to count to 1,000. They probably wouldn't even count to 100 quite often. You know? In other words, the word 1,000 really is rather like the modern American word zillions. You know, when you say, oh, there are zillions of these things. Zillions is our modern word, or at least the Anglo-American modern word, for an uncountably large number. Right? And so I'd suggest to you that actually the 1,000 idea was really rather like that. They were kind of saying, oh, it's zillions. You know, it's a really long time. It's, you know, it's beyond our reckoning, in a sense. So, having destroyed all this stuff about the millennium, you might be wondering why on earth I'm standing here talking about it. Well, it's this, that regardless of anything cosmic, we do have a dating system which is primarily European in origin. However, it has now spread to the whole of the world. It's the technical and the business dating system for the whole of the world, and nowadays it's called the Common Era, or CE. And then we have and so we're reaching the year 2000, and this, in terms of our way of seeing things, in our way of counting things, this is significant for us in terms of our accounting system. It's a significant thing because we give a lot of attention to, for example, the new year. Every new year, everyone, I don't know exactly what you do in Holland, but in England, everyone gets really drunk and they have a party and they all stay up late at night. And they also do these things called New Year's resolutions. People make a promise to themselves about what they are going to do or what they are not going to do during the coming year. And usually that promise lasts for about 2 weeks or so. But the ritual is very much there. And then, of course, there's the turn of a decade, and when a decade turns, people have, they drink even more and they get even more excited about things. And then you have the turn of a century, and when you get to the turn of a century, it does cause you to start thinking about things, about what's happened over the last century and what might happen over the next century. Well, now we're coming to the turn of a millennium. And in that sense, take away all the cosmic stuff, take away all the mythology, and just look at us, in our modern day people. It causes us to think about 1,000 years. 1,000 years back and 1,000 years forward. It obliges us to think about this. And this is actually, in itself, very, very therapeutic for humanity. Because we're not used to thinking in the long term. We're not used to thinking beyond the next few years, beyond our own lifetimes. We're not used to thinking in terms of generations. And we don't really want to think about a lot of the big issues, or at least when I say we, I mean the general public as a whole. I'm not necessarily talking about people, the kind of people who are in this room. But nevertheless, for people like ourselves, looking at a lot of the big issues which are around today is itself quite a frightening thing. It's a good way to keep yourself awake at night and give yourself nightmares, headaches, and to cause you to really get into some deep, dark spaces sometimes if you really go into it. And I'm sure every one of you has experienced this at some time, you know, when you become fully aware of the ecological issues which are going on today, or when you look at the way in which society has been degrading itself. The quality of human life, the quality of human interaction has been declining over time, and in particular the social togetherness which we experience over the last few thousand years has gradually been declining and declining and declining. And although technically speaking we are in a thing called a society, in many respects we as individuals are very, very much on our own. And this is both a freedom, it's a wonderful, wonderful freedom, because if you have the money, you can go anywhere in the world. Or you can do more or less anything you like nowadays. We're not constrained by the same rules and regulations that might have been the case in earlier centuries. So we have a lot of freedom. But with that freedom, we also have a lot of aloneness, inasmuch as we find that other people in the human race, even our own loved ones, even our own family and our own neighbours, are very, very different from us. And for example, every one of us has fallen in love with someone in our lives, and we've felt ourselves to be so close, and we see the similarities, and then you stay with that person for months or for years, and you gradually notice all the differences between you and another person. And even when you're in a relationship or a family or a group of people, you can at various different times experience your own loneliness in quite a profound kind of way. And so, you know, even discounting all the way in which we have conditioned ourselves to operate, and of course when something big like the year 2000 comes along, suddenly the whole business of going to the work and going to the supermarket becomes a bit small, because we start looking at some of the bigger issues about, many of us have children, for example, and we might look at our children and we think, what kind of a world are we leaving to our children? Actually, you know, people like myself, I'm probably going to be dead in the 2030s or 2040s, but my children are going to be living on until the 2060s, 70s and 80s, and their children are going to be living on then too. What kind of a world are we giving them? So these kinds of questions come up at the millennium, and it does bring up also a very, very interesting mass psychological issue as well, and that is that we in Western society are full-blown schizophrenics. Yeah, do you understand the word schizophrenics? Yeah. We're full-blown schizophrenics. In other words, we can have one set of beliefs which we will subscribe to and live by in certain respects, which are, for example, the kinds of things we've been discussing this weekend, and the kinds of realities that you get into when you're on holiday and you're standing by the sea and you're watching the sun go down, and you think to yourself, oh yeah, I'm feeling clear, and you know, I wish my life were like this all of the time, you know, these kinds of things. Or you might go on a meditation retreat and you might understand the meaning of your life in a new kind of context, and you might say to yourself, right, from now on I'm not going to be like that anymore. I'm going to change my life and I'm going to do things differently. And then you go back home. And it's back into the mechanical round again. So we have one kind of life which is, you could say, our deeper human side. It's what we perceive in the truth of our being. And then we have another kind of life, which is all about Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, and Thursdays, and Fridays. It's a functional kind of thing. It all has to do with computers and 9 o'clock in the morning and getting the kids to school and lunch breaks and all of that. You know? Now, the funny thing is that we have learned how to live with this schizophrenia quite comfortably. And in fact, all of you here, you've developed in consciousness in various different ways, but nevertheless, you will have developed psychological strategies for surviving as a reasonably conscious person in an unconscious world. And so, even people like ourselves, we also subscribe to this strange kind of double think, this schizophrenia. And when we're in one side, we'll be getting the jitters and we'll think, oh gosh, I don't want to go and sit and meditate for 2 weeks. I mean, think of, backache and, we won't get all the proper meals and, they'll be getting us up at 5 o'clock in the morning and, oh gosh, how can I do this? But then you go on a meditation retreat and in 2 to 3 days you think, this is the life. This is what I'm here for. This is the schizophrenia which goes on. And then at the end of your retreat or the end of your holiday or something, you think, oh gosh, how can I go home and handle all that again? And you grit your teeth, and then you're driving along the motorway, and you get back home, and click, 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 all of the programs come back in, and you're back on functioning. On goes the TV, on goes the kettle, in comes the routine. And so we're living in this very, very double reality, and this is where we have got to. And this is also very dangerous. It's very dangerous. We all know, for example, during the Cold War, everyone knew that nuclear bombs were dangerous and that the world could get wiped out, but we nevertheless accepted it. We accepted that the Russians were somehow bad and out to get us, and therefore all these things were necessary in some way. Or even if you were against nuclear bombs, you'd still sort of think, well, what can I do to change anything? And so this schizophrenia has been going on. And it's a very, very interesting phenomenon, this, because it means that our functioning outside that area is functioning in another way. And we had a very interesting experience in relation to the actual event on planet Earth. It is not a significant event. I'll give you an example. 3 million people have died in North Korea. Did you notice it in the newspapers? Did you worry about it? No. 3 million people of the population of this country. Imagine if 3 million, for those of us who were still alive, it would hit you really hard. It would make you feeling up. It would make you wonder what life is all about if 3 million of your fellow people died. So that happened, but nevertheless, on the other side, one person dying caused an almighty change of consciousness. And in fact, I would suggest to you from the inner levels, from deeper levels, this was actually a major operation. This was a major operation. And what was the operation about? It was an operation to see how easy it is to tip people into the other side of their psyche in millions. And what happened with the death of Princess Di, which was a symbolically very rich kind of experience, the symbolism of that woman, everyone suddenly realized as soon as she died there was a lot of symbolism that was somehow activated there. And events do have a way of activating that other kind of consciousness and tipping us into an altered state. And I'm not talking about people who are into spiritual growth, I'm talking about ordinary people. Or, the mainstream of society. Who are actually, I think the Diana event demonstrated that members of the mainstream of society are surprisingly open. If you just pull their pants down, and cause them to just stand there vulnerable for a little while, they're surprisingly open. Because a lot of those people in those streets, when you saw it on the TV, a lot of those people were just very ordinary people. They tended towards the younger end, but they were very ordinary people. And it was because they were really concerned about the world and about the future. And that's what was coming up for them, really. That's what a lot of their tears and their fears were all about, really. And this small event, which was the death of Diana, turned the key and opened the door on that one. And it got everyone out of control. Yeah. Now, we've got an interesting situation coming up in a couple of years' time, which is, first of all, it's this mega new year, which is the year 2000. Now, this in itself is quite a remarkable thing. Now, notice the way in which the PR and public announcements that are going on at the moment, they mainly want to make it into the biggest firework party of all time and the biggest booze-up that you ever had. You know, that's really the way that a lot of people would like to take it, into a big party. And then presumably, we all go back to work again afterwards and carry on as normal. That's presumably what the picture is for most people. However, it's not going to really be like that. Because even though at the moment in the late 1990s we're trying not to think about it, there's going to be quite a major phenomenon going on, which is where everyone across the world realizes, golly, the 20th century is over. All that is going that way. You remember all that stuff about Russians and Americans? Remember all that stuff about Hitler? And remember all that stuff about supermarkets and consumption and cars and pollution and population growth and all of those things? That's all going that way. You know? You know, you've probably had this in your own life, that feeling of relief, you know, when finally you get through to the divorce or something in your marriage and you suddenly realize, thank God it's over. You know, or you've been in a nightmarish job and you've been stuck there, or you've been living in a house which has become a prison. And you know that feeling of relief that comes up when you realize, golly, it's over, it's finished. Well, there'll be something like that kind of feeling going on. Although, even though most people don't really know what the future brings. But they certainly know what the past was all about. And so there will be that kind of shift of consciousness happening in the back of consciousness, really, not the front. It's going to be happening behind there. And there's the additional thing about time, about the fullness of time. We'll be thinking to ourselves, well, what's the year 2100 going to be like?